Hey, this is Dr. Eric Osansky, and during this presentation, I'm going to talk about food triggers and Hashimoto's. All right, so let's go ahead and get these slides up. And there we go. All right, so I'm going to start off by talking about the Triad of Autoimmunity. And with Triad of Autoimmunity, this involves a genetic predisposition, involves an environmental trigger, and the third component is an increase in intestinal permeability, also known as a leaky gut. So according to the Triad of Autoimmunity, which is also known as the three-legged stool of autoimmunity, you need all of these factors, these three factors. So again, genetics, environmental trigger, and a leaky gut. And so even though the focus will be on food triggers, I'd like to briefly talk about some of the common triggers of Hashimoto's. So first one is food. So gluten and dairy are some common examples, and we'll be talking more about these, especially gluten, in a few minutes. Stress is another trigger, causes dysregulation of the immune system, and there's other mechanisms, causes a decrease in secretory IgA, and that could lead to leaky gut, which, as you know, is also part of the Triad of Autoimmunity. And microbes, so infections, pathogenic bacteria, parasites, viruses, these also could be triggers. And then environmental toxins, so example, mercury or BPA, bisphenol A. And so all of these different triggers, as well as many more, will be discussed in my book called Hashimoto's Triggers, which is going to be released in early March of 2018. All right, and this is a photo of my book, so you could see my book cover here. And also, you could get a free chapter from my book by visiting this website. All right, so why is food a trigger in some people? Well, before talking about this, I'd like to talk about IgE and IgG, IgE allergies and IgG sensitivities. So IgE allergies, this is an immediate reaction. So for example, if someone has an allergy to peanuts and they have that anaphylactic reaction, usually that's within a few minutes, or bee sting, so it doesn't have to be a food. You could have, of course, allergies to to pollen and animal dander. So an IgG sensitivity, though, that's more of a delayed sensitivity, or a delayed reaction. So once again, with allergies, it's almost immediate. Sometimes it could be a little bit of a delay, like maybe an hour or two. But IgG sensitivities, it could be not only a few hours, but in some cases a few days, which can make it challenging to tell at times if someone has a sensitivity, which is why when you go on an elimination diet and then you reintroduce foods, you ideally only want to reintroduce one food every 3 days, just in case you have that delayed reaction. So, but that essentially is the difference between an allergy and a sensitivity. And so this next bullet point mentions just because you have an IgE allergy or IgG sensitivity to a food doesn't mean this food is a direct trigger. So bringing up peanuts again, if you have an IgE allergy, it doesn't mean that peanuts is an allergy. I mean, chances are if you have an IgE allergy to peanuts, you probably haven't been eating peanuts. So probably most likely is not the trigger behind your Hashimoto's condition. But with IgG, so I mean, you could have IgG sensitivity to gluten, which could be a trigger, but you could also have an IgG sensitivity to another food, such as, let's say, broccoli. Not as common, but if someone has that IgG sensitivity to broccoli or asparagus or a healthier food, this doesn't mean that this food is a trigger. Now, if you're eating that food, it probably is causing inflammation, so it doesn't mean that you could safely eat that food. But as far as it being a direct trigger of Hashimoto's, not necessarily. And then so molecular mimicry. So this gives an explanation here. And so sorry, I'm getting some technical difficulties here, but So molecular mimicry, so as it says here, like gliadin, some believe that it has an amino acid sequence that resembles that of the thyroid gland, so resulting in molecular mimicry mechanism between the immune response to gluten and some of the proteins that are involved in thyroid function, such as thyroid peroxidase. So not only with food, but the focus, of course, is on food, but it could also, you could see molecular mimicry with infections as well as environmental toxins. But let's go ahead and move on to the next slide here. So food is not a trigger in everyone. So, and again, as this mentions, this is one reason why some people don't feel better when eliminating common food allergens, and gluten is an example. Some people don't feel better when they eliminate gluten. You probably have visited, if you're one of these people, you probably have visited forums or Facebook groups, and you've seen people where all they did is eliminate gluten, and they felt dramatically better. Sometimes had a dramatic decrease in the thyroid antibodies. But again, this doesn't describe everyone. In that case, the example I just gave, where they did feel better, antibodies decreased, then yeah, gluten would apparently be a trigger. It might not be the only trigger, but if it's having that dramatic of effect, it's a good idea. I mean, it's a good idea probably in everybody to get rid of gluten, but especially in that case, you want to get rid of gluten. And we'll talk more about this, but this is also why some people don't feel better when following AIP diet, which is an autoimmune paleo diet. So autoimmune paleo diet, you're not only avoiding gluten, but avoiding dairy and some other foods. And I think I'm going to talk about this in a different slide. So I'll hold off a little bit. But again, some people follow a strict autoimmune paleo diet and they don't feel better. It doesn't mean that it's not benefiting you. It just means that in all likelihood, food's not a trigger. Although, as this bullet point mentions, the lack of symptoms when eating certain foods doesn't mean it's not a trigger. So, there are some people, including myself, if I eat gluten, I do not experience symptoms. That doesn't mean that gluten is not having a negative effect on my health. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a trigger. So anyway, you can't just go by symptoms. And again, that does make it challenging as well. And so in addition, even when gluten isn't a direct trigger, it can still cause a leaky gut. So that's what I was getting at before, where even if you're not sensitive to gluten, or if you don't feel better when eating gluten, ideally you want to avoid it because it does cause the evidence shows just a few years ago was discovered that gluten pretty much causes a leaky gut in everyone, not just those with autoimmune conditions such as Hashimoto. So that's a great reason to avoid it, and a big reason why many healthcare professionals will recommend for people with Hashimoto's or all autoimmune conditions to avoid gluten permanently, because if it causes a leaky gut in everyone, and if a leaky gut is a factor in that triad of autoimmunity, then you are taking a risk when eating gluten or reintroducing gluten. All right, so direct triggers versus leaky gut triggers. I do talk about this more in my book. So in the book Hashimoto's Triggers, I talk about direct triggers. So, again, gluten can be a direct trigger through that molecular mimicry mechanism that I mentioned earlier, but it could also be a leaky gut trigger. And by leaky gut trigger, meaning just as the name implies, it can cause a leaky gut. Same thing with an infection. An infection, certain infections can be a direct trigger, once again, through that molecular mimicry mechanism. And there's other mechanisms I talk about in the book, but that's one of the more common ways. But in addition, infections can also cause a leaky gut. So that's so again, an infection or a food could be potentially be a direct trigger, or it could be a leaky gut trigger, or it could be both in some cases. All right, and of course, it's possible to have multiple triggers. So if someone has sensitivity to gluten, and if, let's say, gluten's a trigger, and let's say they avoid gluten, so they don't feel better, so they come to the conclusion, well, gluten, I don't have any food triggers. Or if they go on an autoimmune paleo diet, so if they go on a 30 days, they go on a strict AIP diet, and they don't feel better. So again, it very well might be because food is not a trigger, but maybe it could also be because you have multiple triggers. So maybe you have a food trigger and you have an infection. And some might come to the conclusion, or they might think, well, wouldn't I feel somewhat better even if I got rid of one of the triggers? And in many cases, the answer is yes. But there's a saying, I forgot what the exact saying is, but if you sit on 2 tacks, and if you remove 1 tack, you're not necessarily going to experience 50% improvements. So same thing with removing a single trigger. If you have multiple triggers, but if you only remove one, yeah, a lot of people will feel better. Some people will feel significantly better, but some people might not. Everybody's different. So that's why, again, you can't always go by symptoms. Sometimes you can, and symptoms are important, but again, you just not feeling better when going on an AIP diet or just eliminating gluten by itself. It doesn't mean that you don't have that sensitivity. Again, you very well might have multiple triggers. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the problem with gluten. So again, many people are sensitive to gluten. Not everybody. Again, gluten does cause a leaky gut in everyone, which I think not only did I mention, but I think I mentioned again on this slide. But here, so celiac disease versus non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So most attending probably know what celiac disease is. It's an autoimmune condition like Hashimoto's, and gluten is the trigger. It's the direct trigger, and again, it also could be a leaky gut trigger. So in people with celiac disease, you definitely want to completely avoid gluten. But even if you have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity, so again, that's not where it's as it says, it's not celiac disease, but you are still sensitive to gluten. And there's different that you could get a celiac panel, which if it's positive, good chance you have celiac disease. If it's negative, doesn't 100% rule out celiac disease, but there are other tests such as the Array 3 from Cyrex Labs, which is a comprehensive test involving gluten, and that could give you a better idea if you have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And then again, there's that bullet point, gluten causes a leaky gut in everyone. So, so again, even if you're not sensitive to gluten, because it causes a leaky gut, good idea to try to avoid gluten, especially while restoring your health. I mean, no question, everybody, while trying to get into remission, should avoid gluten. As far as after you're in remission, good idea to continue avoiding gluten. Some people will reintroduce gluten, and some people will relapse. Some people will reintroduce gluten, and maybe they won't relapse. Doesn't mean it's not causing a leaky gut, but again, maybe it's just just they haven't consumed enough of it, or again, maybe they need exposure to another trigger. The problem is you don't know what category you'll fall into, so it's always a risk when reintroducing gluten, even after you get into remission. Some people have some gluten, they do okay. Some people have gluten and they relapse. So there is that risk. So some wonder, and I cover this more in my book. I actually have not only a whole chapter on food triggers, but I also have an entire chapter talking about glyphosate and GMOs. And so some will ask, is the problem real with glyphosate and not with wheat, for example? Because I pretty much spray the crops with glyphosate. But it's probably a combination. I mean, in some people, maybe it is more glyphosate than gluten, and vice versa in others. But yeah, either way, it's hard. Obviously, it's difficult to tell if the problem is in some people with gluten or glyphosate. But yet another reason to try to avoid especially wheat, but just all gluten really. And then so dairy, that's another common question people ask. Well, okay, so I shouldn't have gluten. How about dairy? And a lot of people watching just know that they shouldn't have dairy. Again, at least while trying to get into remission. As far as after remission, again, some healthcare professionals recommend to avoid dairy 100% for good. I don't necessarily agree. I do think that there's a risk of reintroducing dairy as well, because dairy cross reacts with gluten. I'm not sure if yeah, there we go. So not, as this bullet point mentions, not only is dairy a common allergen, but also cross reacts with gluten. So dairy could produce gluten antibodies. So some will recommend just to avoid both gluten and dairy forever. Now, again, maybe that is the case, but some of my patients have been successful in reintroducing dairy without relapsing. Again, there is a risk, just like there is with gluten. So, but a lot of people love dairy and they're willing to take that risk. And there's healthier forms of dairy, and there's dairy that doesn't have as many of the proteins, like, the casein is one of the main problems, but, whey also could be a problem. But anyway, so like ghee, for example, ghee, very low in the proteins of dairy. Some people might do okay with ghee, but then there are people that will reintroduce, yogurt, or maybe they'll reintroduce raw milk or milk from a goat or a sheep and do okay. Again, I know some people hate this answer, but everyone is different. So it's hard to tell, really impossible to tell who will do okay when reintroducing a certain food and who won't do okay when reintroducing a certain food. But I will say that, dairy, I'm not as opposed to people reintroducing dairy, even though, again, it is a risk, so maybe I should be opposed, but again, I realize that it's also, it definitely can be done, of course, with both gluten and dairy, but again, it is challenging to avoid these foods permanently. And again, there are some people who have already made up their mind, or maybe some people did food sensitivity testing, which I'm going to bring up briefly, but so I'll hold off on talk about that. But anyway, so as I mentioned, so this means that consuming dairy can create gluten or gluten antibodies. And in corn, I haven't spoken about corn, but this is a common allergen. And again, like dairy, it also cross-reacts with gluten. And like I mentioned in parentheses, most corn is genetically modified. So another reason to avoid corn. But even if someone is eating organic corn, because sometimes I'll get this question, well, how about if I eat organic corn, organic non-GMO corn? Again, it's not just that it's genetically modified, but it's also a trigger. So if you do eat corn, if you hopefully you reintroduce it at least initially, and maybe until you get into remission. But after you're in remission, if you do reintroduce it, hopefully it's non-GMO. But again, it's not just the problem isn't just with the genetic modification, but again, corn is a potential trigger, cross-reacts with gluten. Okay, so should you follow an autoimmune paleo diet? Should you follow an AIP diet? So again, this is where I talk a little bit more about AIP diet versus standard paleo diet. So standard paleo diet, essentially you're eating fruits, vegetables. If you're not a vegetarian or vegan, you're going to eat meat and fish. You could eat eggs, you could eat nuts and seeds. You could eat healthy oils. And I think that pretty much covers it. Some coconut products, some dark chocolate with the standard or regular paleo diet. Again, I don't know if that's officially allowed on the standard paleo diet, but it seems like most healthcare professionals, including myself, are regular consumers of dark chocolate. Now, AIP diet, autoimmune paleo diet, you don't want to eat not only, unfortunately, the dark chocolate you want to avoid, but also the nuts, the seeds, the eggs, and the nightshade vegetables, and that makes the AIP diet very challenging to follow. So again, autoimmune paleo diet, that's eliminating the most common allergens. And an AIP diet eliminates foods that can interfere with gut healing. So again, that's why you're eliminating eggs and nuts and seeds. Eggs can be a common allergen, but they also have some compounds in egg whites that could interfere with gut healing. And so again, who should follow an AIP diet? Should have been a question mark after this bullet point. But again, really, there's two categories. So one, those with an autoimmune condition. So that makes sense. It's called an autoimmune paleo diet. So someone with Hashimoto's, or, if anybody, I help people with Graves' disease as well. So if anybody watching this with Graves', so ideally, anybody with autoimmune paleo diet should at least consider following, anybody with Hashimoto's, Graves', or any other autoimmune condition should consider following an autoimmune paleo diet for at least 30 days. And again, it's not meant to be like a 6-month or a 12-month diet, but some people will benefit from following it for more than 30 days, like, a few months. So category 2, anyone who has a leaky gut, which according to the Triad of Autoimmunity I mentioned earlier, pretty much is everyone who has an autoimmune condition. But of course, some people who don't have autoimmune conditions has a leaky gut. And again, reason is because, you're avoiding the food allergens, and you're also avoiding things that can interfere with gut healing. So those are the two categories. And then, again, I mentioned this already, theory, very strong evidence, though, that everyone with autoimmune thyroid condition has a leaky gut. So really, it's everyone with an autoimmune condition, not, I probably put that because, again, it's specific. I'm focusing on Hashimoto's during this presentation, but really whether you have Hashimoto's, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, or another autoimmune condition, again, there's a really strong theory that everyone has a leaky gut. And again, I talk more about this in the book. Of course, I couldn't write a book without talking about leaky gut. And I kind of answered this. So how long should you follow an AIP diet for? So at least 30 days. If you're feeling really good after 30 days, you might want to continue with it. If you're struggling and maybe you don't feel, if you followed it for 30 days, don't feel any better, and you're really struggling and stressed out with the diet, then at that point, it might be a good idea to reintroduce foods. And again, I go into great detail with that with my book as well. So I know I'm raving about the book, but I think it's going to be a life-changing book in some cases, and just very excited about my book. All right, so let's talk about some action steps you could take. So consider avoiding gluten, dairy, and corn at the very least. Try to avoid these three, and avoid refined foods and sugar. So these four. And then if you want to go a step further, follow an autoimmune paleo diet for at least 30 days. And again, if you're feeling better, probably a good idea to go longer than 30 days, maybe like 2 or 3 months. Again, try to avoid GMO foods, so genetically modified foods. And then again, just a reminder, a lack of symptoms when eating a certain food doesn't mean that it's fine to eat that food. So I've already spoke about this. So should you consider food sensitivity testing? Again, I go into detail with this as well in my book, but I'll say here that I'm not opposed to food sensitivity testing. It's just that it's not completely reliable. And you could argue that no test is completely reliable, but I don't start people on food sensitivity testing just because false results are common. If someone is not progressing, then I might consider down the road. And so I have done food sensitivity testing using different labs. But again, it's not something that I recommend for everyone. Different healthcare practitioners practice differently. So some doctors will recommend food sensitivity testing to all of their patients. It doesn't mean that they're right and I'm wrong, or vice versa. Just a different approach, and if they're having success with it, that's great. That's obviously why they keep on doing it, because they probably wouldn't continue doing it for a prolonged period of time if they weren't getting good results with their patients. But I start people with the autoimmune paleo diet, which also doubles as an elimination diet. And again, I do talk more about this in the book. I also have some information on this on my website too, but I get into really a good amount of detail with the book as well. And then again, many times following an elimination reintroduction diet can help identify foods you're reacting to. So again, just like I said, that's the approach that I take in my practice. I don't have everyone do food sensitivity testing. All right, so that pretty much ends the presentation. Hoped you learned some great information about food triggers. And again, I do talk about food triggers in my book, and which is again coming out soon. But if you want to get a sneak peek, you could get, once again, a free chapter of my book. And in order to get a free chapter, you could visit this website. And well, that's it. Thanks for tuning in. And again, hope you learned some amazing information about food triggers. All right, take care now.